Welcome back. I'm delighted to have you all here for the second plenary panel of the 2013 Oslo REDD Exchange with a discussion focused on national level progress on REDD+. Before I go any further, I need to share something else. I realized that I had repressed a very unpleasant memory from a previous speaking engagement in Oslo a number of years ago, when I was sternly reprimanded by the interpreters for talking too fast. And I did it again this morning. So by way of atonement, I am, first of all, reminding the participants in the next plenary panel to speak slowly for the benefit of the interpreters and those dependent on interpretation, but also to all of you who will be speaking in the parallel sessions later this afternoon and tomorrow morning. Moderators, it's your job to keep things at a translatable pace. Okay, without further ado, it is now my great pleasure to introduce the moderator of this panel and who will also be joining me in the final plenary on tomorrow afternoon, James Astle, who many of you know is the political editor of The Economist magazine, but especially near and dear to our hearts in forestry world because he's the one who wrote that fabulous special report on forests back in September 2010 that Pat Heru reminded us of in the previous panel. So I'm going to invite James and the panel to the stage, and James will introduce the panelists. James.
Anyway, just mix that with the African. Good. Thank you, Francis. Thank you all, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome indeed to this second plenary session in which we'll discuss national level progress on REDD, especially in four very different forest countries: Peru, Brazil, Ethiopia and Tanzania. And what I hope that we'll get from this session is some nitty-gritty detail. We heard in our first plenary session some excellent, mostly rather high-altitude thoughts on where REDD+ is and isn't going. I very much hope that we're now going to get a sense of how, despite that disappointing high-level, or in some cases non-existent high-level progress, it is or isn't working in these four countries. How distinctive are their approaches to REDD+, and what the governments of these countries and indeed the international community can do, even in the absence so far of big volume funding for REDD+, to accelerate progress. So to that end, I'm absolutely delighted to introduce our distinguished panelists from Tanzania, which is of course one of the four countries with a bilateral forest partnership with Norway. We have Minister Samia Suluhu Hassan of the Vice President's Office, which oversees the Ministry of Environment. From Ethiopia, we have Minister Kabede Yimam Daoud, who's the State Minister in the recently formed Ministry of Environments and Forests. From Brazil, Carlos Klink, who is the National Secretary for Climate Change. And next to Carlos, my friend Dr. Paulo Malcino, who's the Executive Director of one of the great forest NGOs, IPAM, the Institute of Amazon Environmental Research. From Peru, Gustavo Suarez de Freitas, who's the Director of the National Forest Program. Welcome, Gustavo. And with Minister Kabede of Ethiopia, we have his advisor, Dr. Tawalde. So we have the benefit of two experts from Ethiopia. We'll follow the same format in this panel session as in the previous plenary. I'll invite each of our panelists to rather briefly, no more than 5 minutes, I hope, clear their throats with some introductory thoughts. Then I'll interrogate them a little bit. And meanwhile, I do hope that you will all come up with your own questions, your own interrogations, which will be filtered through for excellence, and then we'll put to our panelists later on in the session. So with that, in no particular order, simply because he's sitting next to me, I'll ask Gustavo to to begin events. Thank you.
Buenos días. Voy a hablar en español para que puedan.
Do forgive me, Gustavo. I neglected to mention, I think, because we didn't have this issue in the first session, you should all have translation devices, and I'd be extraordinarily surprised if you didn't all know how to use them. They will give you simultaneous translation in Spanish, Portuguese, and French. Gustavo is going to speak in Portuguese. Paulo is going to make up his mind whether in Spanish. Paulo is going to make up his mind whether he wants to speak in Portuguese or not. Thank you. We don't have a Amharic translation, unfortunately. Sorry, Gustavo.
Gracias, James. Bueno, en primer lugar quiero presentarles el saludo y las excusas del ministro Manuel Purar Vidal, que debería estar aquí, pero por motivos del trabajo del Estado no ha podido acompañarnos hoy día. Bueno, para nosotros en el Perú, la deforestación es un problema fundamental y enfrentarla es una decisión política del gobierno. Entendemos en ese contexto que REDD es un instrumento apropiado, un instrumento útil para ayudarnos a combatir la deforestación, y por eso el Perú está comprometido y está participando en la plataforma del FCPF. Estamos avanzando todos nuestros procesos internos para poder contar con el sistema de monitoreo, registro y verificación. Estamos avanzando en desarrollar el sistema de registro de proyectos, las salvaguardas, en fin, todo lo que es necesario para poder culminar la etapa de readiness de REDD. Igualmente, hemos trabajado en la elaboración del documento para el plan de inversión forestal. Justamente el día de mañana debe verse esto en Washington. Y estamos trabajando, vamos a solicitar la incorporación al programa ONU REDD, específicamente para poder reforzar los procesos de participación con los diferentes actores sociales, pueblos indígenas en particular, pero en general todas las acciones. Entonces, tenemos algunos avances importantes en términos de procesos participativos. Creemos que REDD, si bien no es la solución para todos los problemas existentes, es muy importante para catalizar y para ayudar a que procesos que están actualmente en marcha en los países puedan desarrollarse de manera más rápida y más profunda. En ese sentido, hemos avanzado procesos de participación con pueblos indígenas, con gobiernos subnacionales. Estamos trabajando sobre todo el tema de cómo avanzamos en el enfoque anidado de REDD para asegurar que diferentes gobiernos subnacionales, nosotros llamamos regiones, puedan desarrollar sus procesos de manera homogénea y que puedan luego ser integrados dentro del enfoque nacional de REDD. Sin embargo, somos claros que atacar la deforestación requiere mucho más que REDD. En realidad, necesitamos transformar las formas como hacemos la gestión de los recursos naturales, la gestión de los territorios, y entonces REDD lo entendemos como un catalizador, como un apoyo, como una ayuda adicional. En ese sentido, sin embargo, creemos que REDD debe funcionar de una manera más rápida, más oportuna, porque mientras que estamos discutiendo y haciendo cada vez más complejos los procesos a nivel internacional, la deforestación sigue avanzando. La deforestación es un problema absolutamente real y necesitamos que los ofrecimientos de cooperación que son parte del esquema de REDD puedan concretarse de una manera rápida. Pensar en un enfoque de país, pensar en sistemas simples es lo más importante para nosotros en este momento en cuanto a REDD. Creemos en ese sentido que no debemos concentrarnos en los temas accesorios, sino concentrarnos en los temas fundamentales, ¿no? Podemos y creemos que es importante la cooperación para apoyar los procesos subnacionales, las iniciativas tempranas, pero necesitamos entonces generar también mercados tempranos, compradores tempranos que permitan ayudarnos a lo que se mencionó en la primera sesión, el involucramiento del sector privado en procesos diferentes, en procesos productivos, no solamente dentro de los bosques, sino sobre todo fuera de los bosques, En la agricultura, que es el principal causa de directa deforestación en el Perú, es la agricultura realizada por pequeños agricultores que están ahora sembrando productos como café, como cacao, que son productos que van al mercado internacional y que podrían, si son bien conducidos, bien manejados, pueden ser muy importantes para detener y revertir los procesos de deforestación, pero que si son mal manejados puede ser una causa muy grave de deforestación. El sector privado tiene un papel fundamental que jugar, pero también lo tienen los gobiernos nacionales en establecer las condiciones habilitantes, las reglas de juego, el ordenamiento del territorio, la asignación de derechos. Y la cooperación internacional nos está ayudando bastante en eso. Sin embargo, si no logramos generar mecanismos que aseguren un pago por resultados que atraiga el interés de los privados y de los gobiernos, va a ser muy difícil seguir adelante.
Thanks very much indeed, Gustavo. Thank you for being so timely. You were exactly on 5 minutes. I've never seen this in a conference before, ever. And it bodes very well. We have a lot of speakers, and I do hope you'll all learn from Gustavo. That was a good overview. I sense your frustration that the international community's side of the pact, which was indeed financed on the basis of results of proven slowed deforestation or forest degradation, has not been kept. That's a good framework for this discussion. But please, more nitty-gritty, gentlemen and lady. What makes your country distinctive? What is distinctive about your progress? What is distinctive about the things that you need going forward? Samia, please tell us.
Thank you. Maybe I should start with a little introduction on the forestry resource of Tanzania. And talking of Tanzania, we are talking of Tanzania mainland and the islands of Zanzibar. So within the Tanzania mainland, we have about 33.4 million hectares of forestry resource, of which 16 million hectares are for reserved forest, 2 million hectares forest in the national parks, and 15.4 the open access forest, of which most of the time this area is put in other competing land use activities. As for Zanzibar, we have about 63,900 hectares, and this is about 23.7 of the total land of Zanzibar. This part of Zanzibar is part of East African Forest Eco-Region and one of the world's 200 biodiversity hotspot. So despite of all the significance, worldwide significance of this forest, still deforestation is progressing or continuing. And we talk of 1.1% of deforestation in mainland and about 1% in Zanzibar. So coming of REDD Plus project in 2008 and being implemented starting from 2009, Tanzania has been able to build a strong ground related to conservation and protection of forest resource conservation and protection of forest resource through participatory forest management. We have 9 pilot projects implemented, and all are successfully done. And within these 9 projects, issues of governance and land tenure, incentive schemes, methodologies for estimating deforestation, carbon sequestration, and emission have been dealt with successfully. So I don't know if I have to proceed with the lessons which we learned, or should I go to the challenges which we faced?
Give us some lessons learned, inspire us to begin with.
Among the lessons learned, we learned that the open access forest is the most affected because people are just getting in and do establish themselves within the forestry. And as you know, that Tanzania is bordering 9 countries, and most of them are unstable, politically unstable. So we have refugees who are coming in Tanzania, and most of them get established within the open access forest. Again, another lesson which we learned is that developing forest for deforestation reference and carbon maps used to calculate avoided emission is highly technical and expensive. So it needs a lot of money and technical expertise, which we don't have yet. We are still struggling on that. Another issue is land tenure, which involves, as I said, massive money and effort. But it helped us in putting the village boundaries. We had a lot of conflict within the villages, but now that conflict is over because this project enabled us to put the village boundaries. And village bylaws, they are very essential because the communities tend to respect their own laws, which they safeguard their own interest. So those are some of the lessons which we have learned.
I think that's a great introduction, Samia. Thank you very much indeed. I was particularly interested by your final point on the buy-in from local people. And I know that Tanzania, because of its political history, has that organization. I'm interested to know later on in this discussion how you get from a project to a national REDD level through local people. Carlos, can I ask you to help us next? Because I think you may have to leave early with your permission, Paulo. Carlos, just to, again, brief framing of the Brazilian context. We all know what tremendous progress has been made in terms of conserving Brazilian forests in recent times. I think we may be less clear about where Brazil puts REDD in that picture.
Okay, certainly, James. Thank you also for the opportunity to be here. As you know, yesterday we had an important meeting here in Oslo with Cicero discussing the Brazilian case of deforestation and REDD. Also, as you know, not only on the conservation side, for the last 10, 12 years, Brazil has decreased for more than 80% deforestation rates in the Amazon. So that's a very much significant result of global impact in terms of climate change. REDD is under our national policy for climate change. We have several plans to reduce emissions from all over the board, not only deforestation, but also several economic sectors. So REDD is under this policy. Since 2010, 2011, there is within the Brazilian society, but also including the government and the local governments in the Amazon, a very participatory approach of REDD construction in the country. That later on, we have a steering committee that guides and does all the operations in terms of the national policy on climate change. And this steering committee then, at that time, created a working group for REDD. It's been working since then to create the national strategy on REDD with the participation, with the participation of several ministers, but also civil society. And they basically produced a draft strategy for REDD that was presented back, this working group was presented back to the steering committee of the national policy. We then, last year, we asked the Secretary of Environment of the state levels of the Amazon, all the state secretaries. We promote what we call a task force on REDD. That was very rich in terms of contribution. The states made several contributions to the national strategy. We incorporate some of that into the draft of the national strategy, and then we submitted it back to the steering committee of the national policy for REDD. Right now, the strategy of Brazil is under consideration by this steering committee. It's important to say that the steering committee of the national policy includes not only ministries, several ministries, of course, and not only the environmental side, but also several other ministries, but also the Brazilian Forum for Climate Change. It's a not-for-profit organization that represents all the Brazilian society. Is part of the steering committee of the policy. As you know, James, I think it's important to point out also, of course, we are following initiatives. There are initiatives in the private sector, state level, NGOs, indigenous population going on in Brazil. This is very rich. We are following, we have a high expectation REDD on the upcoming meeting in Warsaw next month. Brazil has been working a lot on that, on the REDD, under the convention. So we have some very high expectations for some approval now in the COP19 during the international negotiations. But I also have to mention that yesterday we had a very nice discussion about the Amazon Fund of Brazil. Since Brazil is being able to reduce deforestation at this tremendous rate, some accounts are pointing out that what Brazil reduced in terms of emissions from deforestation, if you compare 2010, 1999, is twice the amount of reduced emissions from the entire Annex I countries, according to several estimates. So that's very significant. We are also including several other instruments as part of of this whole construction. One important, very important one is the Amazon Fund. The Amazon Fund is a relationship between, is a donation from the Norwegian government to the Brazilian government. And since 2008, we are working with the Amazon Fund. We have so far 43 projects under the Amazon Fund. And a very important one was just approved a month ago in Brasilia, with the organization that represents all the Amazon basin countries. So all countries now are interested, because Brazil has put